All right, back with you tonight on In Focus. The Kingdom of Eswatini has been recently rocked by pro-democracy protests by activists and civil society groups. The groups accuse King Mswati of holding exclusive judicial, legislative and executive powers over the nation's affairs. The Human Development Index ranks the country as one of the world's poorest countries, which is also plagued by corruption. We talk tonight about the state of that country with Anneke of the Southern African Litigation Center. We'll be joined in a moment also by Professor Qambukusa Magagula, but we have also on the line political academic from Eswatini, as well as human rights lawyer and political activist Sibusiso Nhlabatsi. Good to have you, and thank you very much for coming on tonight. Nhlabatsi, let's begin with you. I mean, firstly, we know that the decree in 1973 was put in place by the father of the current king in Eswatini, but in 2005, 2006 or so, some kind of new constitution was put in place. However, of course, questions are being asked today whether or not there has been a discernible progress in terms of changes as far as the restrictive environment is concerned. For example, if we are to start, let's begin on the respect for the integrity of persons.
So you are right that the proclamation of the decree, as it is popularly known, was issued by the current king's father, King Mswati II. But perhaps before I answer your question, if one may start from the beginning, that when the present king came into power in 1986, soon after coming into power, he issued a proclamation amending the 1973 proclamation. So it's Decree number 1 of 1987. Decree number 1 of 1987 simply states that the decree of 1973 is the supreme law of the land, to the extent that any law that is inconsistent with the decree shall be null and void. So the constitution that we are talking about also has a similar clause in section 2, that it asserts itself as the supreme law of the land. Any law inconsistent with it shall, to the extent of inconsistency, be void. So the country finds itself in a situation where it has two supreme laws, one being the constitution in terms of section 2, and one being the proclamation of 1973 in terms of decree number 1 of 1987.
And what do both of these provide for as far as the respect of the integrity of persons? You know, because up until this point, we are still talking about unlawful killings. We're still talking about politically motivated disappearances. I mean, you can tell us about what's happening in prisons and the situation as far as public trial is concerned.
Then the Constitution only protects the right to dignity, and that a person may not be treated in an inhumane and degrading way. I was trying to bring the history because I just want to point out from the outset to your audience that there is no difference between the current constitutional dispensation and then the 1973 proclamation, because the Constitution itself, much as it guarantees the right to dignity, the right not to be treated in an inhumane and degrading treatment, the proclamation is still there, it's still in force and effect. So the upshot of it is that we're having a constitution with a Bill of Rights, but it is made in the same spirit and tenor with the 1973 proclamation.
What agitated for the 2005 constitution, even after the amended 1973 proclamation?
It was difficult to govern the country without a constitution. And the country had not had a constitution for a long period of time. So the country was under pressure to adopt a constitution. But one must give credit to the drafters and the framers of the constitution, because they were able to come up with a document which resembles the 1973 proclamation. And you can see from the process, the constitutional making process itself, that it was made and projected to come out with a certain outcome. For example, political parties or group of people were not allowed to make submissions during the constitutional review process. You know, then that makes you say with certainty that the outcome was predetermined, because how did the people know that the people are going to reject political parties, for example, during the constitutional making process? So I think that they were very clever in the process of making the constitution by excluding people, ensuring that the constitution that we are having today is one that is without constitutionalism.
Yeah. Anneke, good to have you. Let's bring you in here. To what extent has the Constitution improved what is called the respect for human rights in Eswatini?
Good question. I think there are positives and negatives. And if I can just take you a step back, when 50 years ago today, the 1973 decree was declared by King Sibusiso, it banned all political parties, and it basically took away, put all the powers of the legislature, the executive, and the judiciary in the hands of the king. Yeah. At some point in the 80s and 90s, SADC was pushing Eswatini to actually start reforming the constitution. And what the Constitution of 2005 did was it does have judicial, it does separate the different arms of government, it does provide for the right to freedom of association, so and it does state that it's the supreme law of the country. So in theory, in any other country, there would not be this debate, because it would be clear the 1973 decree is gone at the point when you get the Constitution. But take, for example, 3 years after the Constitution came into being, the government declared some organizations terrorist organizations, and they start using other laws to sort of impact whenever there was criticism of the government. And that, for example, the Suppression of Terrorism Act, the Sedition and Subversive Activities Act, that continues to be used till today. And it gets used whenever anyone criticizes the government, and especially criticizes the king. So, and that then begs the question, because whenever Eswatini goes outside and speak to leaders in other countries, it would say, we are a democracy, we have a constitution. In theory, that is true, because all the rights are there. The Constitution is the supreme law. In theory, the 1973 decree doesn't exist. In practice and on the ground, it's an entirely different situation. Political parties are banned under other laws, not necessarily under the 73 decree. They are arrested constantly. And even, I think, 2 weeks ago, there was an article, one of the headlines in the local newspapers in Eswatini, which actually, where the chairperson of the Elections and Boundaries Commission emphasized that the king is above the law. Now, you can't have that and say you're still a democracy. And that, for us, is the key question, that after 50 years, are we, as part of the international community as well, just going to say, well, it's okay, they've got a constitution, they're a bit different, but they're fine? Yeah. Or are we actually going to say this is unacceptable, that you have 50 years later exactly the same situation on the ground, whatever you might say your laws are or aren't, and those sort of things?
We'll talk about that, what the state's attitude is towards international intervention, particularly on allegations of the violation of human rights. But we've got Professor Magagula now joining us on the line. Professor Magagula, good evening, and thank you very much for coming on and joining us tonight here on In Focus. Maybe let's put a broader question around the role of politics, right, in an endeavor to try and deal with this decree that was proclaimed 50 years ago. Let's look at what political parties, opposition political parties, are allowed to do in Swaziland within the current constitution.
Thank you for inviting me to this discussion. Well, since the 1973 decree, political parties have not been allowed in Swaziland. Or even after the Constitution of 2005 was written and approved as the law, fundamental law of the country, still political parties don't operate above ground and for purposes of which political parties are supposed to do. Political parties, by their nature, are supposed to work with the basic function of forming government. Now, in the Constitution, there is a clause that says elections into a government can only be done through individual merit, not political parties. So political parties have not been allowed to register and enter for elections to contest for power. So when you say the freedom of association, like they can associate, but for what purpose? If you are a political party, because you're a political party, you want to go and enter into power and run a government. So this is why, according to my analysis, the political parties have not been allowed. They are operating to put pressure on the government rather than to contest for political power. But even those that are putting a lot of pressure on the government are frowned upon. If they view them as a threat, then they are harassed. Some of them have been banned and been labeled as terrorists under a new law that was promulgated after the 1973 decree.
Yeah.
So
how is the country governed? My understanding is that you have 59 members of the House of Assembly. You will tell us what they do. The king has the right to choose another 10 to add to that. There's a 30-strong Senate that is there, that is not elected by the people, but also it's the king who chooses the Prime Minister and the cabinet. Is that the setup?
Yes, that's the setup. It is the prerogative of the king to choose the Prime Minister. So even if the people may wish to have a certain individual as Prime Minister, they don't have any influence on that. The king will decide who he wants to be Prime Minister. Part of the reason why the two MPs are serving, they are arrested, they are in custody now. They were saying, why don't we, as people, citizens of Southern, choose our own Prime Minister? They weren't even vocal about the whole system as such, but they're just putting that pressure on the system, on the rulers to allow people to choose their Prime Minister. But of course, this resulted in a broader demand by the people. Even the Parliament itself, like you have indicated, he appoints a lot of people in the House of Assembly. He appoints a certain number, and in the Senate, he appoints even a bigger number in terms of percentage than what he appoints in the House of Assembly. But at the end of the day, whatever is deliberated upon in Parliament, if the king doesn't agree with it, it won't go as law.
So the lawmakers can make the law, but they would still need to put it past the king for his approval. I'm saying the lawmakers in Parliament can make the law, but for that to be put in place as law, it would still need the king's approval.
Yes. They can come up with a bill and agree on it, send it to the king, and if the king doesn't like it, it won't pass. It won't stand. Just like that. Unlike in some cases where maybe, let's say, you would say the bill has passed through the House of Assembly, passed through the upper house, Senate, and the head of state rejects it and probably send it back for deliberation. They make a joint house seat, and then if eventually they pass it, they like it as such, it will stand as law. But not in the case of Southern. It will reject it, and there is no other mechanism that can be used to force it to be a law.
That's exactly what I was coming to. I was coming to that about the civil judicial procedures and remedies. Where does that put them in terms of how things are operating right now? Sibusiso, I don't know if you can still hear us.
Oh, sorry, I thought you were still talking.
No, that's for you.
Doctor. Sorry. Yeah, you see, when it comes to the judiciary now, also you need to understand the power of the king first in appointing the members of the judiciary. So there is a body called the Judicial Service Commission. What the king does, he appoints all the members of the Judicial Service Commission. Then the members of the Judicial Service Commission are then expected to recommend people who are fit for appointment of being judges of the superior courts to the king. Now, automatically, this shows the supremacy of the king over the judiciary. So then, therefore, it puts the administration of justice in question. It then also clouds the rule of law and brings to the fore the question whether Swaziland does have the rule of law. So that's why you find that the rights that are guaranteed and enshrined in the Constitution, which one expects that the courts will be able to uphold and protect, the courts are not going to be able to do that because in the main, they do not pay allegiance to the Constitution, to the rule of law, but they have to pay allegiance to the supremacy of the king. It's about what the king wants. So the judgments and the posture of court's ruling are based on ensuring that the judge wants to be careful not to issue a judgment that will be seen to be upsetting to the king or the monarch. So basically, it then it compromises the administration of justice in Swaziland as we see it today.
On conversation continues Anneke, Professor Qambukusa Magagula, as well as Sibusiso Nhlabatsi, who is a human rights lawyer, still with us. And you are part of the conversation, 072-110-5584. Let's have a look at what you're saying tonight on WhatsApp to this conversation. Siyabonga saying King Mswati is a dictator and greedy. He is a leader that does not love his people and treats everyone living there as foreigners. During the unrest in that country, people were shot at by the police with live ammunition, and no one to this day was held accountable for the actions of the police who were directed by him to shoot them to death. Those who survive are left with disabilities, mostly using walking sticks. Siyabonga, thank you very much. You can also weigh in on that conversation. And Anneke, that's where we want to come in as well. I mean, part of what I read, for example, is that the Constitution does provide for police to behave in terms of human rights and how they treat people, but how they treat them is really then put in policy. So it's not really articulated in the Constitution, but it's in the policy in how they should conduct themselves. So police can choose to ignore that and do whatever the king says.
It's an interesting situation because sometimes, because the policy framework is perfect, the legislative framework is there. It allows for independent judiciary. There's a new police act which has a lot of provisions which tries to make the police accountable. And then the police act in the way that they do, where they have no accountability and zero respect for people's right to freedom of assembly, for example, even though there is a Public Order Act that requires that the police protect people's right to freedom of assembly. It's actually one of the most progressive laws in the region, but that is the law, and then you see what happens in practice. And I think that is where people get stuck, because if the police just implemented the law, there would be no problem, because it clearly has certain parameters for how they must act and how they must protect rights. Now, when the police doesn't do that, what becomes clear, or when the judges don't do that, it's not clear whether they're not following the law because they're acting on the instructions of the king, or whether they're not following the law because they believe their jobs would be in jeopardy if they don't do things that they believe the king would like them to do. Yeah. So I don't think the king knows all the violations that happens in the country and says, do all of it. I think there's a breakdown in communication where people sort of accept that there's impunity for whatever they do. And
so I think is there no clear line as to what is state and what is the king? and what is the law?
Oh, there's no line at all. And I think, so in Eswatini you have all the land is Swazi nation land, for example. So even if you, as a police officer or a judge, want to have family for your land, you're not going to risk that by fighting with the chiefs or fighting with the king or doing anything that might put anything of that in jeopardy. The public service is a big employer. You're not going to jeopardize that by potentially doing something that might look like you're not supporting the current monarchy. So I think people are there's just a lot happening with zero accountability and zero space for ordinary citizens to actually say what they want to say because their rights are completely ignored.
Yeah. Professor Magagula, is there a sense that there's a culture of silence or non-questioning of authority, self-censorship of some sort as it pertains to some of these human rights issues? Professor Magagula, are you still there? Oh, you seem to have lost him there on that line. So let me bring you in here. I mean, when you look, for example, at the civil liberties and freedoms of press and freedom of expression, do you get a sense that there is some kind of culture of silence or non-questioning of authority that is prevalent, or even some degree of self-censorship?
It's glaring, especially in the press, and it's not far-fetched why it is so obvious. Not long ago, the editor of the Nation magazine, together with the late lawyer Jan Masebo, were arrested for publishing articles in the magazine where they were criticizing the then Chief Justice. So not long ago, the Times of Eswatini was heavily fined for publishing a certain article against the former president of Senate. So while you have this guaranteed right to freedom to freely express yourself, as I've said earlier, the question is the court prepared? Are the court officers then prepared to protect that guaranteed fundamental right? But the attitude that you get is that because they themselves are not immune from criticism, they will find that they will use that as a shield. They will use verdicts that are very harsh to ensure that the person who wants to express themselves are not able to. As Anneke has said, even it's not only the targeted to journalists, because even the Suppression of Terrorism Act itself, it does limit to a greater extent the right to freedom of expression, because if you look at the definition section, how broad it is, to the extent that to compel a government to do and not to do a certain thing can be described as an act of terror. So you would want to limit your views, your opinion, if you have a statute at the face of a fundamentally guaranteed right, but you have a statute that says if you want a government to do something or not to do something may amount to terrorism. Just imagine words, spoken words, in the context of the Suppression of Terrorism Act can amount to an act of terror. So then people will exercise self-restraint, media houses will self-censor themselves. We can see from the local dailies that, even if they want to publish a story, they are careful not to go beyond what might be viewed as overboarding or overstepping. So there is a great deal of censorship, and it's unquestionable.
Yeah. Professor Magagula, I believe you're back with us on the line. One of the questions, of course, is this debate that is ongoing about what is un-Swati. For example, criticizing the king. Those who are for the king would say, no, that is un-Swati. Is there common agreement and understanding of what is un-Swati, so to speak, for lack of a better word?
Come again. What is it that they call it un-Swazi?
Yes. For example, criticizing a king publicly.
Oh, yes. Oh, yes. Yes. That is what they say. That is un-Swazi. Now, one would like to talk about this at approach it at two levels. The first one would be to say, does the Swazi society evolve, or is it not evolving like all other societies? When you are talking about democracy, the liberal version of democracy, there is nobody in society that will not be challenged when they raise their views. That is one of the basic elements, tenets of democracy. So if we are saying as Swazis, I'm Swazi, does it mean we are static, we remain as we were centuries ago? That is the first question that we should be asking ourselves. The second one is, how far true is it that if I'm Swazi anyway, is it true that the Swazi king was never challenged in our own traditional custom, way of life, if you like, which I don't believe that is true. There is a saying which will say in Swati, the king is the king because of his people. It wasn't a band, which means that he listens to the people. And when you listen to the people, you are subject to criticism. When you say things, the people will say, no, we don't think king that is right. This is the way to do it. And then he will listen to them and do what the people say. As far as I'm concerned, this issue of Swazi is being I could say political manipulation of the minds of the people who are not well versed about issues of Swazi law and custom traditionally. And secondly, those who are not aware that we cannot just remain as we were before even liberal democracy came. That is how I will respond to that one.
Back with you tonight, Anneke from the Southern African Litigation Center, Professor Qambukusa Magagula, political academic from the Eswatini institutions there, as well as Sibusiso Nhlabatsi, who is a human rights lawyer and political activist. Let's come to that question then, Anneke. Is there something that the international community can do? Is there something that non-governmental organizations can do in this instance?
Yes, I think it's important to continue highlighting the situation in Eswatini. What's sad, and this is even the case apart from this channel, for example, but very few newspaper houses, for example, cover Eswatini and cover the politics there. It's a country that's very much forgotten sometimes, and I think that's important to continue highlighting things. The country has elections coming up this year. And we know that the AU and SADC and the EU would, for example, send missions there to declare the elections free and fair. And they always declare it free and fair, even though political parties can't participate in it. And I think that's a big question for us about how do we push those institutions to actually be quite critical in how they assess the fairness of an election. And that would apply even with Zimbabwe's elections coming up or many other countries' elections, that those institutions can't just go and rubber stamp a process. They need to look at whether that process actually substantively amounts to democracy and amounts to a free and fair procedure. And if, as we discussed now, the population itself feels that they can't air their views openly, then how do one even assume that it's a free and fair election? So I think there's a lot there that what we need to do is have substantive engagements, and we need the international community to actually have those discussions with the king, have those discussions with the government itself, and definitely go and go to the prison where there are two members of parliament who's been detained for over a year.
But what is the attitude of the state? I mean, I know that should, for example, on this show, because sometimes we do carry, for example, we carried the unrest, and we got reaction from the government who wanted to come on the show and give us their views to say we are pushing particular narrative that is not true about Eswatini. So that is their reaction, I suppose. But
sure.
How do they broadly feel about the intervention of international communities in their affairs?
It depends. For example, a few years ago, the UN Human Rights Committee was looking into Eswatini, and it was being reviewed, and the delegation from the government was specifically asked, has the 1973 decree been replaced by the Constitution? And they were very clear that it has been. So then you say, well, okay, if you can say that in an international body, can you please just say that back home so that people feel they can say what they want to say? So there's two discourses, and those discourses never meet. There's the one public face and everything's fine, and yes, we have a constitution, and there's the other discourse about what happens back home. Yeah. And I think what's useful about these sort of conversations is for us to actually discuss what's the real situation. And I think the government would admit that their laws actually allow political parties to exist. I think they fear criticism and what it might mean if those political parties get into government. I don't think they should be that scared because, I mean, the population is, I mean, they'd still have the majority whatever happens. So it's really, I think they need to make the first step. What SADC has been calling for, and some political parties have called for, is a constitutional dialogue. Yeah. I do not believe that you can have a constitutional dialogue if people don't feel free in their own country. And who would organize that dialogue and it can't be the government itself if you have this inability for the two sides to come together and actually discuss now what. Yeah. So there has to be a give and take, I think, on all sides, and we'll see. Yeah.
Nhlabatsi, let's talk about the corruption question, right? And whether or not there is transparency, for example, in how official corruption is handled. Do the laws of the country provide, I mean, yourself as a lawyer, for example, to litigate against officials who are corrupt, and other criminal penalties for official corruption?
Yes, on paper there is a body that was established through the Prevention of Corruption Act, which is called the Anti-Corruption Commission. Now, what the body does, it is investigate and arrest politicians for corruption. But interestingly, the Anti-Corruption Commission was frustrated by the Chief Justice. So you can see the irony there, because there was a time where they wanted to arrest a minister for alleged corruption. It was a minister and a member of parliament. But the Chief Justice issued a judgment setting aside the warrant that the commission wanted to execute. Now there are talks that the Anti-Corruption Commission should be merged with the Human Rights Commission. I'm not sure you have ever heard of something like that in the whole world. How does the Human Rights Commission and the Anti-Corruption Commission becomes one body? But it is those frustrations and the lack of political will to fight corruption that therefore makes it a free for all. So presently in Swaziland, it is difficult to fight corruption, and then the unfortunate part is that corruption is usually done by the most powerful people, the most connected people, and if we have a body that is not so independent, that is able to fight corruption without fear or favor or prejudice, we find what is happening in Swaziland, where the Chief Justice is in control of an anti-corruption commission, and then frustrates its operations, and it is stalled now as it is. It's there, but it's like an old toothless dog. It can bark but seldom bite.
Prof, maybe as we wrap up, Professor Magagula, the conversation from your point of view, is the state or even the monarchy sensitive to international criticism to a point where it could in any way cause them to act differently?
Pardon?
I'm saying, is the state or even the monarchy sensitive to international criticism to the point that it could cause them to change and act differently?
I I'm missing the last part of the question, please.
I'm saying, Professor, if, for example, the international community were to be more vocal and more critical of the human rights violations that are taking place in Swaziland, could that be enough to cause the monarchy or even the state to behave differently?
It will not be enough, as far as I'm concerned. The international community should get itself involved in understanding the whole political spectrum of the country. And doing that will not only require them to talk to government, it will require them also to talk to political and organized society movements and find out what the problem of the country is. Most of the speakers have been talking about no changes have taken place since the inauguration of the Constitution, 2005 Constitution. No changes. So society will be misinformed by looking at that document and say, oh, there's a lot, the Bill of Rights and so forth is there in the country, and yet it's just on paper. Not much is being done to follow that constitution. So my view would be that the international community should actually come to Swaziland, get the information from the people themselves. Then they will know exactly what is happening in the country.
Professor Magagula, much appreciated. Thanks for coming on. Sibusiso Nhlabatsi, thank you for joining us, as well as Anneke coming into the studio with us tonight. That's where we'll leave the conversation for tonight.